Hello again. I am doing another reaction video. I have nothing else to do this weekend and I'm having lots of fun doing it. So this is another historical video on YouTube from the very popular channel that explains segments of history from different periods. And this one is about the Atlantic Wall and the German reaction to D-Day. And I'm going to watch it and make some comments about some things it could improve on. Let's sit back and get going.
June 6th, 1944 is a day that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has been looking forward to for a long time. His wife's birthday. With bad weather making an invasion impossible and intelligence suggesting that Eisenhower's waiting for more troops, the commander of Normandy's defenses has decided to go home and surprise his wife with a pair of Parisian shoes.
There is more to this story about the reason he went back. It isn't just because of his wife's birthday. I'll come to that when it gets to that part of the video later on, but there's a little bit more to this story that I want to explain.
The middle of the night, his phone rings. The invasion's begun. The Nazi leadership had begun preparing for D-Day even before the Allies held their conference at Tehran. Following a British commando raid at Saint-Nazaire and the landings at Dieppe in 1942, Hitler had realized that even if an invasion lay years off, the Allies were already capable of hitting ports in occupied France.
It's a bit muddled, this. Yes. In terms of the sequencing, the Atlantic Wall had started before Saint-Nazaire and before Dieppe. This suggests it was a response to those landings, which isn't really the case. And of course, it's not counting the other commando raids that had been on the coast of Europe in the previous 2 years. Don't forget Churchill, let's set Europe ablaze. So there are other things that have happened into the Channel Islands. There's the Bruneval raid of February 1942. By just mentioning Saint-Nazaire and Dieppe, it's overlooking a lot of other things, but I understand the limitations of what they can cover in one show. We'll keep on going.
His solution was the Atlantic Wall, a line of coastal defenses that originally clustered around ports, but eventually stretched from the Spanish border to Norway. Rather than building a continuous defensive barrier, German engineers drafted 1 million forced laborers from France to create
1 million forced laborers from France. It's not just France. You just said the Atlantic Wall covers from the Spanish border to Norway, but then now you're only mentioning workers from France. The TOD organization, TODT, used workers from all over various parts of occupied Europe. There were Belgian, Dutch, Norwegian, there were even Eastern European workers brought in there. So yeah, you're right with 1 million, but it wasn't just French workers on the coast. And specifically later on, I think an important thing to mention, which it doesn't, is that there's a labor shortage drastically when you get into the early part of 1944. Part of it is because of just the fact slave laborers are dying. The Germans are still building underground emplacements and positions and factories and things in the heart of Germany, and they haven't got enough ventilation. They're using asbestos as filtration systems, and people are dying of asbestos poisoning. They're dying in bombing raids. There's just a manpower shortage of slave laborers. So a key thing that this should be mentioning is that by the spring of 1944, all along the coast of Normandy and elsewhere in Europe, German soldiers are having to do the work on the fortifications themselves. They are having to pour concrete and add to the beach obstacles. Arthur Janker, the commander at Widerstandsgesetz 5 on Utah Beach, famously had been working himself as a lieutenant on the concrete and on an inspection visit when Rommel goes there sometime in months before D-Day. Janker shows his sort of calloused fingers where he'd been working on concrete. So the fact that the Germans are having to use their own troops to add to the fortifications is a sign of the lack of slave labor that the Germans now have, but it's also meaning the German troops aren't practicing their response to that. They're not doing weapons training. They're not doing that. If they're busy making concrete, it's time they should be doing something else. So missing a trick of not mentioning that. Keep on going.
Create a string of machine gun and artillery positions. These hard points had overlapping fields of fire, with artillery intended to fire along the length of the beach rather than out to sea. This allowed the German army to...
Okay, so he's got a bit muddled here, because that image there is showing the large coastal artillery positions, often manned by Kriegsmarine. Now, he just said these aren't designed to fire out to sea. Now, these particular types on screen now, they are designed to fire out to sea. They are anti-shipping. The bunkers point out to sea. When he's talking about to fire down the beach, he's talking about the weaponry in the Widerstandsnests, which are, as we've covered in other videos, the ones that have 75 and 88s pointing sideways down the beach. But that is not what the image on screen is representing. It is showing the coastal artillery batteries that do point out to sea. So there's a
than out to sea. This allowed the German army to cover a larger amount of territory with fewer men, a consideration that was crucially important by 1944. In late 1943, Hitler had appointed Rommel as overall commander of forces in northern France. It was a political as well as practical appointment, leveraging Germany's most famous general in order to reassure the troops and the public. Rommel also had a personal relationship with Hitler, which allowed him to operate semi-autonomously outside the chain of command. When Rommel arrived, he was shocked at the state of the Atlantic Wall. Command had stripped troops for the Eastern Front, and many of the men were either new recruits, conscripts from Eastern Europe, or had gone soft garrisoning the wine-soaked towns of France.
The wine-soaked towns of France. Okay, so let's unpack that for a second. We're talking Normandy, which is not a wine region. If they are soaked with alcohol, it's going to be cider and Calvados. But this image is already setting out this idea that all the Germans in Normandy are crap. And it's weird how these videos do that, because sometimes they want to make them out to be elite. We get the 352nd being battle-hardened in some videos that I've reviewed here. In this case, they're trying to suggest they're all old men, they're all physically weak. It's way more complex than that. It's not anything like a nuanced stuff about the German troops and capabilities of the defenders in Normandy.
Allied bombing had nullified the Luftwaffe. Rommel went to work. He sent veteran units to supplement the poorly trained divisions. He seeded the ground around the defensive emplacements with mines that jumped into the air before exploding. At low tide, he sank a forest of wooden stakes tipped with anti-tank mines that sat just below the waves.
Now that's a bit confusing again. I'm sorry. There are some obstacles with mines on, but it is by no means the most common type of beach obstacle. Most are physical obstacles. They have metal that puts a hole into the bottom of the landing craft, or a log ramp that flips the landing craft, or the Belgian gate that blocks or otherwise hinders the landing craft. The problem with the mines is putting mines on posts that go in the water, they get wet every day. They're just not going to function. And so you do see photos of German obstacles with mines on the top, but I think it's mostly a propaganda thing. The Germans kind of trying to convey this idea that they're heavily defended. There are lots of mines along the coast, but what we need to be clear about is they're in the scrubland kind of behind the beach, before the bluffs, or depending on which beach it is, what the terrain is like. There aren't that many contact mines on wooden poles on the beaches. This is suggesting that's what they all are like. It's a small part of them that are that type.
Now, any invader would have to choose between running the gauntlet at high tide or landing at low tide and crossing 300 miles of open beach. He also flooded the low country, erected poles to tear apart gliders, and stationed troops inland to slow the Allied advance in preparation for a counterattack. But planning around that counterattack was a problem. First of all, they didn't know exactly where the Allies would land. Luckily, German intelligence pulled off a coup. They successfully deployed multiple agents in England. Soon,
that's a weird bit of language there. Multiple agents. He'll go on in a minute to explain that these are double agents. But six, we're talking six. Multiple to me suggests dozens and dozens. It's a weird, I would say several, or just not specify a number. It's weirdly worded.
They were receiving reports of armies marshalling to attack Pas-de-Calais, along with diversionary attacks in occupied Norway and, what was the other one? Normandy? Whatever. And aerial reconnaissance confirmed forces massing for these attacks. Of course, every single one of those German agents was actually working for the British. Good work, Garbo. Regardless of where the landings took place, Rommel believed the battle would be decided on the beaches. Should the Allies establish a beachhead, it would be over. In his plan, the divisions defending the coast would slow the enemy down in preparation for a decisive counterattack. As a result, he wanted the Panzer Reserve under his own command, close to the shore, in order to sweep the Allies back into the sea. However, Hitler's leadership style started to affect strategy. From his early days in the Nazi Party, Hitler had promoted a kind of social Darwinism among his staff, giving them overlapping responsibilities and intentionally fostering feuds and competition. This meant that subordinates couldn't amass enough power to challenge him, and it elevated his position as the final arbiter of any dispute. In this case,
I have a bit of a problem with that. This is implying that Hitler, in a Machiavellian kind of way, is deliberately setting up a weakness of command with a conflict of interests and who's in charge of what. It's just happening because it's disorganized. It's happening because it's a dictatorship. It's happening because of other things. I don't think Hitler is deliberately setting up a command structure to have competition, to keep himself at the head. That's adding a level of planning to this that I don't think is the case.
Rommel was opposed by officers, including the elderly Eastern Front veteran von Rundstedt, who wanted the tank reserves held near Paris. This would keep them flexible in case the Allies landed somewhere unexpected, and shield them from shore bombardment. Rommel countered that the long drive toward the coast would make them vulnerable to air attacks. After fierce debate, they put it to the Führer, who, ever indecisive, created an unworkable compromise. He broke up the reserve, giving Rommel 3 panzer divisions and keeping the larger reserve around Paris as a personal unit, which couldn't be
more or less true.
Express permission. Only one of Rommel's divisions, the 21st Panzer, was sent to Normandy. So the stage is set for June 5th, and the weather could not be uglier. With conditions so poor for both sailing and flying, senior officers relax in the knowledge that the Allies will not arrive anytime soon. Many take the opportunity to rush home on leave, and that is when paratroopers start.
Okay, this is what I said I would explain in the beginning. Absolutely correct. The weather had set in, and it is one of the reasons that gives German officers the confidence to think they don't have to be near the beaches. But there's the key one that it's missed out here, and that is the Germans have anticipated that the Allies will land at a period of high tide at dawn. You always land at dawn because you've got the whole day to unfold your plan. Weirdly, the German system of putting the obstacles on the beaches has forced the Allies' hand by putting the obstacles there, which he explained, to rip the landing craft up at high tide. The Allies would like to land at high tide, ideally, because landing at high tide puts you closer to your objectives. The roads, the draws off the beaches are there much closer than having to go over 300 or 400 yards of sand. But by putting the obstacles on the beaches, the problem is the Allies will lose too many landing craft coming in at high tide, and they can't afford to lose the landing craft because each landing craft is not just doing one journey, it's going to do several journeys back and forth, bringing in more and more men. And if you lose even 10% of your landing craft on obstacles in the first wave, that's 10% less to go back and get the second and third and fourth waves. So the compromise was the Allies chose to land in a period of low tide at dawn so they can, in fact, see the obstacles ahead of them on the beach. They don't lose landing craft to them on the run in. And then with the assault wave, our engineers who destroy the obstacles using various types of equipment, including tanks and pulleys and explosives and what have you, making a space on the beach so that when the tide comes in behind them, there's now room for the other landing craft to come in at nearer to high tide as the original intention without the obstacles being there. So it's now in June 4th, 5th, 6th, a period of low tide at dawn. And the Germans think, well, the Allies are going to land at high tide. So that's the main factor that is persuading the German commanders that they don't need to be near the beaches, because they're not going to come because the tide's all wrong. So the weather is one half. The time of tide is the other half. The Allies have decided to come at low tide just after dawn. So it should have explained that. We continue.
To land. At 5:30 a.m. on June 6th, German soldiers peer out of their bunkers to see shapes in the morning mist, ships stretching from horizon to horizon. Then, aircraft engines. A massive Allied bombardment rocks the ground as bombs, naval shells, and rockets pound French soil. But the bombers drop too far inland. The rockets fall short.
Right. Okay. So it's still talking about Normandy generally now, but now it's talking about the result of the bombing on Omaha specifically. And it does get to Omaha later on, but it's not being clear right now what it's talking about, because absolutely, yes, the bombing on Omaha Beach did land too far inland from the beaches, but not the bombing on Utah, for example, where the bombers came down the coast, lower level, lower altitude, parallel to the beach, And there, the bombing was much more accurate. Bomber Command are bombing targets behind beaches. Point du Hoc Bomber Command hit on D-Day, which they hit very much on the nose. There's bombing Sword Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach. Some of it's landing in its target, some of it's not. But this is a very, very simple way of explaining it that therefore is getting it wrong. It's only talking about the bombing on Omaha, and it's not being complex enough to talk about the bombing over the 5 beaches, although later on it does confirm that Omaha was where the bombers went inland. So too vague this, and therefore being imprecise.
Short. Naval guns make little headway against the steel-reinforced bunkers. 1,745 tons of ordnance drop on Omaha Beach without...
See, now it is talking about Omaha Beach.
The roads inland are wrecked. Worse, Allied paratrooper and glider...
I'm going to play that again.
Without killing a single German.
The roads inland are wrecked. No, just not the case. Well, okay, let's quantify this. It's kind of mixing up the pre-D-Day bombardments over March, April, May with the D-Day morning bombardments. But we, as the viewer, when we hear this comment that the roads have been knocked out, are concluding it means right behind the beaches. I'll be honest, I can't think of any roads anywhere near the beaches, all 5 of them on D-Day, that have been put out of action by the Allied bombing. Not at all, okay? Now, inland, in the previous bombing, the Allies are bombing on June the 6th, places like Onissa-Odon and Saint-Lô and Caen and other cities inland, and they are having some problems with traffic and road junctions, but this is miles away from the beach. So this has got things all muddled up now about what the bombing is supposed to do and what the results of the bombing are.
Worse, Allied paratrooper and glider units land between the static units and the reserve, with resistance elements destroying crucial bridges and rail lines, meaning that reinforcements...
It's not really being clear again. The resistance activity to destroy bridges and rail lines is, again, a long way away from Normandy. In fact, a lot of the activity of the French was up in the Pas-de-Calais area, where, in fact, the Allies kind of misled the French resistance into believing the invasion would be coming in the next day in their area, but in fact, it was going to happen in Normandy. But the reason of having resistance activity going and blowing stuff up in Calais region, it's drawing attention to Calais. So the Germans think, that's where the real thing's coming. So alas, and very sadly, some of the resistance operatives up in the Calais area who were going out, blowing up trains and doing stuff, assuming the invasion would come in behind their area the next day, it didn't happen in there. It happened several hundred miles south. And so some of these were picked up by the Germans, interrogated and tortured and killed. So the actions of the resistance on D-Day are, again, very complicated. And this is simplifying them to a point where it's actually not getting it right.
And supplies can't get through. Landing craft begin to plunge toward the shore. On Omaha Beach, the Germans see the first Allied soldiers trudging in the surf. Machine guns open fire. Far away, Allied soldiers lie face down, pinned, as the first wave of mortars and artillery shells fling bodies into the air. Months of preparation mean that German artillery crews have ranged out the beaches and know exactly where to drop their ordnance. The initial slaughter is monumentally one-sided. One American company at Omaha takes 92% casualties. By 1:30 that afternoon, German observers at Omaha report that small groups of Americans have broken through, but the defense is holding. They're pushing the Allies back into the sea.
There may well have been a German report at 1:30 in the afternoon suggesting that they're holding the beach, but it is not representative of what's actually happening on Omaha Beach. There are breakthroughs off Omaha Beach as early as 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, where Allied troops have already got in behind and eliminated German Widerstands nests. It's not good, this. It's all implying there's single acts happening that are affecting things. Poor.
But Omaha is the exception. Despite fierce resistance, the British have broken through at Sword and Gold, and the Canadians at Juno. The botched American landing at Utah has reorganized into a chaotic opportunity. Here, the bombardments have had more effect, and the terrain isn't as challenging, but men still die in droves. The chaos on the beach is mirrored at every German headquarters between Normandy and Hitler's vacation home at Berchtesgaden.
I just want to go back and say, I don't like the idea of referring to Utah as a botched landing. What happened is there's a navigation issue and they land about a mile further south than they were supposed to. But botched really, to me, suggests incompetence and people really fucking it up. And bad language. And saying there's no terrain issues on Utah Beach is also a bit problematic in that there's no terrain issue of a bluff immediately behind the beach, unlike on Omaha. But it's not mentioning the fact there's the floodplains behind, and you've got to push inland over a mile-long causeways with floods either side. And if there are Germans on the high ground ahead, that could be a nightmare situation. So it's a different type of terrain problem, but saying there are no problems with the terrain on Utah is not really fair. Again, I'm sorry, folks, I'm being really picky about this because I want to just quantify, I do like what these kind of animated videos do in getting across a kind of simplified version of history for younger people, but the script has need of improvement, in my opinion.
Generals argue over whether to commit reserves and where. Rommel is rushing toward the battle in a staff car, unable to issue orders. His rival, von Rundstedt, quickly orders the 21st Panzer to meet the British advancing on Caen, and issues orders for the reserve units near Paris to move out.
This has got very muddled again. It always happens with the reference to 21st Panzer. 21st Panzer have their own commanding officer, Feutinger, who various stories about where he was. He's probably in Paris that morning. But Feutinger is moving his division independent of really anything that Hitler or von Rundstedt is saying. People are always getting muddled up between Hitler releasing the big tank reserves and the division that was already there. 21st Panzer is effectively operating independently. Now, there is an issue because they can't find their commanding officer that morning because he's with his girlfriend in Paris or something, and he makes his way to the beach later on. They get in touch with him. He's on a car, and he's having troubles getting there through the roadblocks and air power overhead and things like that. But when he gets to Normandy, it's his command of 21st Panzer that's making the difference. Von Rundstedt really is having no impact on it. And indeed, their regimental commanders within 21st Panzer who are acting independently because they've actually seen their aircraft flying over, gliders coming over, and they're getting their tanks, engines running and what have you. And eventually a movement, it talks about in a minute, is made towards the beach, which is all separate of Hitler and von Rundstedt and anybody else at a higher level. It's giving way too much emphasis on the high command and what their response is, and it kind of ignoring the fact there are local commanders who theoretically know what to do.
But his orders are countermanded. That unit can only be moved by the Führer's personal order, and Hitler is asleep. Ever since his days as a Bohemian in Vienna, Hitler has always been a late riser. Rigid procedure dictates that the Führer should not be woken unnecessarily, and even in the face of invasion, no one wants to break this protocol. After all, what if it's only a diversion? When Hitler eventually wakes at noon, he is thrilled the invasion has arrived. This, he says, is his chance to decisively crush the Allies. And yet, he delays. It's 4 p.m. before he orders the Panzer Reserve to move out. By that time, the clouds have cleared, exposing the column to Allied air power. So instead of advancing, the unit ends up hiding in the woods until dusk. It will take them
really oversimplified. It's like it's implying there's one unit. Is it talking about 21st Panzer now? Is it talking about the other divisions that are spread over hundreds of miles around various parts of Paris? There's not one single column of tanks moving towards the beach. It's all very muddled, very complicated. And it brings up another point I want to make about, I see it all the time, this idea that if Hitler had been up earlier, he could have done something to stop the invasion. If Hitler had been aware of the invasion a couple of days earlier, if he'd somehow found out that they were coming to Normandy, a week before the invasion actually happened, he can do something about it. He can redeploy units, he can move things, move Luftwaffe units around, move tank divisions around. But there's an implication, I see it all the time, that if he'd been up earlier, he can do some masterstroke that's going to affect the outcome in Normandy. He can't. There's nothing he can do. It's too late now. What could have happened is, as I said a minute ago, commanders nearer the beaches making better decisions, acting more spontaneously, not waiting for things to come down from a higher level, being more determined to do something. That would have made a difference. But really, whether Hitler gets up at 4 in.the.morning or 4 in.the.afternoon, there's really nothing he can do to change the outcome of June the 6th. It's all too late. All what we're talking about with the movement of the Panzer Reserves is about how it might influence the greater Battle of Normandy that will follow the actual landings.
Them 2 days and a night to join the battle. As the Allies overwhelm German defenses and march inland, Hitler spends his day ordering V-1 revenge strikes not on Normandy but on London, then holds a conference with minor functionaries. When Goebbels shows him the Normandy landings on a map, Hitler exclaims with delight, "Just where we expected them." Goebbels, who has heard Hitler rant for months about how the Allied target would be Calais, simply nods at the Fuhrer's historical revisionism. After all, Hitler is somewhat right, in a way. They all knew that a diversionary landing would happen at Normandy. Probably best to keep the strong units in Calais.
They didn't all know a diversionary landing would happen in Normandy. There is a possibility of a diversionary landing in Normandy or a diversionary landing somewhere else. It's all too binary. The statements being made here are all to this is, and there's a lot more complexity. There's a range of thoughts amongst German high command about what's happening. People are changing their mind. Information is coming in. Way too binary.
Meanwhile, the Atlantic Wall is crumbling. Even at Omaha, the defense has degraded. Ammunition is running out. Artillery emplacements fall silent. Americans begin breaking through and enveloping the casements. At Caen, the Germans see one last opportunity, a gap between the Canadian and British lines.
Very true.
A grenadier regiment rushes to exploit it, and by 8 p.m. radios that they're on the beach.
Okay, they weren't on the beach. They were on the road that runs parallel to the beach between Sword and Dune. They weren't on the beach.
Armored support they can hold, but the Allies have gotten wise. When the 21st Panzer tries to follow...
Okay, so it's implying the Grenadier Regiment and the 21st Panzer are separate units. The Grenadier Regiment is a unit of the 21st Panzer. It's not a separate unit. It's a Grenadier Regiment is moving forward, if you like, a reconnaissance force, and then they are going to contact the rest of the 21st Panzer, or parts of it, to follow them up that same movement. So it's not two separate units. It's a reconnaissance element of the 21st Panzer. Come on, get a grip.
They find themselves running a gauntlet. Fire pours in from both sides. Every minute, another tank explodes. Seeing that the window of opportunity has closed, their commander orders them to halt and dig in around Caen. Stiffening. All along the battlefront, Allied units begin failing their first-day objectives of advancing and linking up inland. By dusk, the Allies have scattered beachheads, but not much more. Within days, German reinforcements will arrive, and the hedgerows of Normandy will become a killing field that will dwarf the casualties of the landings.
Okay, so there's, again, quite a few things to unpack with this. Sure, very few of the Allied units reached their ultimate objectives of getting towards the road that runs inland. But take the Canadians on Juno Beach, where there are 3 levels of phase lines they're hoping to achieve. One is getting off the beach, one is getting a bit inland from the beach, and number 3 is kind of getting to this main road there. No, the beachheads have not been the size they're supposed to be, but the use of the word kind of failure and to reach their objectives that I have problems with. Ultimately, the plan for D-Day is just to get there, establish that foothold, get your troops in and don't have them repelled on the beaches there, which they have achieved. It has gone really, really well. The link up will happen. It'll just take a bit of time. The other thing is the immediate reference to the bocage. Okay, I'll just rewind the video for a second there. The bocage is one part of the terrain in Normandy. It is not all the parts of the terrain in Normandy. There's become this idea that immediately inland from all 5 of the beaches is the bocage, the hedgerows. There are hedgerows inland from Omaha Beach towards Saint-Lô. There are more kind of at the southern part of the Cotentin Peninsula up towards Cherbourg. But the area, for example, south of Sword Beach, south of Juno Beach, around Caen, the area behind Caen, is open wheat fields and kind of rolling farm country. Yes, the hedgerows cause casualties, but so do the open fields around Caen. It's 2 different types of terrain. Then you've got river valleys and things like that as well. This is a too simplistic version of what Normandy is like. It's way more than just hedgerows.
Normandy will become a killing field that will dwarf the casualties of the landings. D-Day is over, but Operation Overlord could still fail.
No, it can't.
The Allies are going to have to push just as hard on D-Day +1, and D-Day +2, and every day after that. For all of these forces, American, British Commonwealth, French, German, and Soviet, the fight would continue for 11 murderous months. But the Allies now had a beachhead, and in trying to throw them back, Germany would spend more men, fuel, and equipment that they could ill afford. Allied victory is a long way off, but for the first time, it's in sight.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I like the summary there, but Operation Overlord is not in any doubt of failure, even by halfway through June the 6th. It's all about, as I said a minute ago, getting that all-important beachhead there. The rest of it will just take care of itself. Sure, there'll be loss of life. Sure, there'll be problems. Sure, Germans are going to send reinforcements up. But with the might of the Allied air superiority and the naval support we have, and the fact there's not that much of a Kriegsmarine presence, there's a Luftwaffe presence, but not as much as the Germans would have wanted. With all that massive amount of tail that's behind the initial assault force, divisions coming ashore day in, day out, there's only one outcome here, and it's going to be an Allied victory. So, frankly, early afternoon on D-Day, the 5 beaches are more or less secured. That's it now. The worry is over. Operation Overlord is going to be a success. How long it's going to take, how many men are going to be killed, which day we make the breakthrough, where the breakthrough is, those are going to be found out by men enduring what they had to endure in the campaign. But the uncertainty is gone. So there we are. That's the end of this one. I hope you enjoyed my ramblings and my comments. Please don't forget to subscribe. Please, if you're watching any of my videos, just take a second to press like. It all helps with the algorithm. But that's it. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Paul Woodadge. I'm a Normandy-based author and military historian. Thank you very much for your time. Cheers.